My in-laws visited and declared, "Our daughter deserves better than a low earner like you." They even handed me a list of improvements. I kept quiet, but that night, I canceled the monthly allowance I'd been sending them anonymously. Suddenly, their luxury cruise plans fell apart, and they were knocking on my door. I, 32M, kept my success secret. My in-laws called me a failure until their money dried up. The doorbell rang at exactly 10 in the morning. I was working from home, halfway through reviewing a quarterly report when my wife opened the door to her parents. They hadn't announced they were coming. They never did. They just showed up whenever they felt like it, treated our home like an extension of their own, and expected us to drop everything. I heard her mother's voice first, that sharp tone she always used when she was about to critique something. She was commenting on the living room furniture, saying it looked worn and asking why we hadn't replaced it yet. My wife tried to deflect, mentioning we were comfortable and didn't see the need for new things. Her father grunted in agreement with his wife, adding that successful people invested in appearances. I stayed in my home office for another 20 minutes, finishing what I needed to finish. When I finally emerged, they were seated on the couch they'd just insulted, drinking coffee my wife had made. Her mother looked me up and down with that expression I'd grown familiar with over the past 5 years, the one that said I was perpetually disappointing. Her father wasted no time. He asked me how work was going, but before I could answer, he launched into a speech about how a man should be earning at this stage of life. He said their daughter had married beneath her station, that they'd hoped I would prove them wrong, but clearly that hadn't happened. My wife started to protest, but her mother cut her off, saying they were only speaking the truth out of love. Then her mother pulled out a folded piece of paper from her purse. She handed it to me with a tight smile and explained it was a list of improvements I needed to make. She said they'd spent considerable time putting it together because they cared about their daughter's future. I unfolded it slowly while they watched. The list was typed, single-spaced, and detailed. It included things like getting a better-paying job, upgrading my wardrobe to designer brands, purchasing a luxury car instead of my reliable sedan, joining an exclusive country club, and taking their daughter on expensive vacations at least quarterly. There were more items, each one more absurd than the last. At the bottom was a note suggesting I consider whether I was truly good enough for their daughter or if I should step aside for someone more worthy. I read it twice while they sat there, her mother sipping her coffee with that satisfied look, her father nodding along as if he'd just delivered sage wisdom. My wife looked mortified, her face flushed with embarrassment and anger. She told them this was inappropriate, that they had no right to come into our home and attack me like this. Her mother dismissed her concerns, saying she was too blinded by emotion to see they were helping. I folded the paper carefully and tucked it into my pocket. I thanked them for their feedback and told them I would take it under consideration. My wife stared at me, clearly shocked that I wasn't fighting back. Her parents seemed pleased with themselves, interpreting my calm as acceptance of their judgment. They stayed for another hour, talking about their upcoming plans. They were excited about a luxury cruise they'd booked for next month, some Mediterranean voyage they'd been planning for over a year. They mentioned it cost a fortune but said they deserved it after working hard their whole lives. After they left, my wife immediately apologized. She was furious with them, said she couldn't believe they'd done something so cruel. She asked why I hadn't defended myself, why I'd just accepted their insults. I told her I had my reasons and asked her to trust me. She looked confused but nodded. That evening, after she'd gone to bed, I sat in my office and opened my laptop. I navigated to the banking portal I accessed once a month, the one connected to an account my in-laws didn't know existed. For the past 3 years, I'd been anonymously sending them $5,000 monthly. They thought it came from some investment account her late grandmother had left them, a story I'd carefully constructed through a lawyer friend who sent official-looking statements. The truth was simpler. I made very good money, far more than anyone in my wife's family realized, and I'd been quietly subsidizing their lifestyle because it made my wife happy to see her parents comfortable. I canceled the automatic transfer. Then I sent an encrypted message to my lawyer friend, asking him to draft a letter informing them that due to market conditions, the investment fund would be temporarily suspended for 6 months pending restructuring. It was vague enough to sound legitimate, but clear enough that the money would stop immediately. The first week passed quietly. My in-laws didn't visit, and my wife seemed relieved by the distance. She kept apologizing for their behavior, and I kept telling her it wasn't her fault. She couldn't understand how calm I was about the whole thing, but she stopped pressing when I asked her to let it go. The second week, my wife received a call from her mother. She was panicking about some unexpected financial issue. Apparently, their investment fund had sent them a letter about suspension, and now they were scrambling because they'd made several large purchases anticipating the usual monthly deposit. My wife was sympathetic, but explained we couldn't help with that kind of money. Her mother's tone shifted from panic to accusation, suggesting that if I made more money like a proper husband should, we'd be able to help family in need. By the third week, things escalated. Her father called, demanding to speak with me directly. He said they needed to borrow money, that their cruise was in jeopardy, and that family should help family. I listened patiently while he explained their situation, how they'd counted on certain funds that hadn't materialized, how they'd already paid deposits they couldn't get refunded. When he finished, I told him I was sorry, but we didn't have that kind of liquid cash available. He got angry, brought up the list again, said this just proved his point about my inadequacy as a provider. I remained polite and ended the call. The fourth week, they showed up unannounced again. This time they looked different, stressed and tired instead of smugly superior. My wife let them in, concerned about what was wrong. They sat on that same couch, and her mother actually cried, something I'd never seen before. She talked about how they'd had to cancel their cruise, how they'd lost thousands in non-refundable deposits, how their financial advisor had informed them the investment fund might be permanently restructured. Her father looked defeated. He started talking about how they'd been counting on that money, how they'd made commitments based on expected income. Then he did something that surprised me. He apologized for the list. He said they'd been out of line, that stress about their own finances had made them lash out inappropriately. He asked if there was any way I could help them, maybe a loan they could pay back once their investment stabilized. I let the silence stretch for a moment before responding. I told them I appreciated the apology, but I wanted to address something first. I asked them if they'd ever wondered about our lifestyle, about how we managed on what they assumed I made. My wife looked at me questioningly. Her parents seemed confused by the question. I explained that I'd been deliberately modest about my career. I worked in quantitative finance, specializing in algorithmic trading systems for institutional investors. I didn't talk about it because the work was technical and most people's eyes glazed over when I tried to explain it. More importantly, I'd learned early in our relationship that my wife's family had strong opinions about money and success, and I'd wanted our marriage to be built on something other than my income. Her father asked what I was getting at. I pulled out my phone and showed them my most recent pay statement. The number was significant, well into six figures, not counting bonuses and stock options. Her mother's hand went to her mouth. My wife stared at the screen, then at me, her expression cycling through shock, confusion, and something else I couldn't quite read. I continued. I told them I'd been sending them money anonymously for 3 years. The investment fund they thought was from her grandmother's estate didn't exist. It was me, transferring $5,000 monthly because I'd wanted to help them without it becoming a point of conflict or obligation. I'd stopped the transfers the night they'd given me that list because I'd realized something important. They didn't respect me, and money I gave them while they held me in contempt wasn't helping anyone. It was just enabling them to maintain their illusions about who I was and what I was worth. The room went completely silent. My wife looked like she might faint. Her mother started crying harder, but differently now, with shame instead of self-pity. Her father couldn't meet my eyes. He asked why I'd hidden this, why I'd let them think I was struggling. I explained that I'd never claimed to be struggling. They'd simply assumed, based on superficial observations, and I hadn't corrected them because I'd wanted to be valued for who I was, not what I earned. Her mother tried to apologize, stumbling over her words. She said they'd been terrible, that they'd judged me unfairly, that they understood now why I'd cut off the money. Her father added that they didn't expect anything from me, that they'd figure out their financial situation on their own. There was a defeated quality to how he said it, a recognition that they'd burned a bridge they hadn't known existed. My wife finally spoke. She asked why I'd never told her about the money I'd been sending. I explained that I'd wanted it to be genuinely anonymous, that if she'd known, it might have created complicated dynamics with her parents. She pointed out that it had created complicated dynamics anyway. She wasn't wrong. I looked at my in-laws and told them I'd think about reinstating the support, but things would be different going forward. If I decided to help them financially, it would be openly, and it would come with the expectation of mutual respect. I wouldn't tolerate being treated as lesser than while simultaneously funding their lifestyle. They could accept me as I actually was, or they could manage without my help. The choice was theirs. They left shortly after, subdued and apologetic. My wife and I spent the rest of the evening talking. She was angry that I'd kept secrets, even if my intentions were good. She felt caught between defending me and being honest about how the deception bothered her. I understood her perspective. I'd been so focused on protecting myself from her parents' judgment that I hadn't fully considered how my choices would affect her. Over the next few days, we had several difficult conversations. She wanted to understand my thinking, why I'd felt the need to hide my success from everyone, including her to some extent. I'd never lied about my work, but I definitely downplayed it. I admitted that part of it was about control. Growing up without much money, I developed complicated feelings about wealth. I didn't want to be valued or devalued based on my income. I wanted people to see me, the actual person, not the financial statement. She listened and shared her own perspective. She said she'd always known I was smart and capable, but she'd struggled with her parents' criticism of me. She'd defended me to them countless times, but part of her had wondered if they had a point, if maybe I wasn't as ambitious as I could be. Finding out I'd been successful all along, while letting her doubt herself, felt like a betrayal, even though she understood my reasoning. Update 1. 2 weeks passed before I heard from my in-laws again. My father-in-law called and asked if we could meet for coffee, just the two of us. I agreed, curious about what he wanted to say without an audience. We met at a quiet place near their home, and he looked older than I'd ever seen him, worn down by more than just the financial stress. He apologized properly this time, without the defensive qualifications people usually attach to apologies. He said he'd spent years judging me based on assumptions, seeing what he expected to see rather than what was actually there. He admitted that his own insecurities about money had made him project his fears onto his daughter's marriage. He'd wanted her to have security, but he'd defined security so narrowly that he'd missed the actual security I'd been providing all along. I asked him about the list, why they'd felt entitled to dictate how I should live my life. He winced at the question, but answered honestly. He said they'd convinced themselves they were helping. That tough love would motivate me to achieve more. They'd never considered that maybe I'd already achieved plenty and simply had different priorities about how to display that achievement. He acknowledged how arrogant that was, how disrespectful. He didn't ask me to reinstate the money. Instead, he asked how he could repair the relationship, what it would take for me to trust him again. I appreciated that he'd framed it that way, acknowledging that trust had been broken and needed rebuilding. I told him the truth. I needed to see consistent change, not just words but actions that demonstrated genuine respect. I needed him to defend me when his wife started criticizing, to shut down the narrative that I was somehow inadequate. He agreed without hesitation. Then he asked if I'd be willing to have dinner with them, both my wife and me, so they could apologize to her as well. They'd put her in an impossible position, and he recognized that now. I said I'd discuss it with my wife and let him know. When I told my wife about the conversation, she was skeptical. She'd heard her parents apologize before, usually right before they reverted to their old patterns. But she also wanted to believe they could change, that maybe this had been enough of a shock to their system to create real transformation. We agreed to the dinner, with clear boundaries about what we would and wouldn't tolerate. The dinner was awkward at first. My mother-in-law cried again when she saw my wife, apologizing for putting her in the middle, for making her doubt her own judgment about her marriage. She admitted she'd been living vicariously through her daughter, trying to recreate some fantasy life she'd imagined for herself when she was younger. She'd projected all of that onto our marriage without considering what we actually wanted or needed. My father-in-law backed up everything he'd said to me at coffee. He told my wife directly that I'd been a better husband and son-in-law than he'd acknowledged, that his own pride had blinded him to reality. My wife listened, her expression carefully neutral, and then she spoke. She told them she loved them, but that she'd been protecting them from consequences for too long. She'd made excuses for their behavior, smoothed over their rudeness, tried to bridge the gap between their expectations and reality. She was done doing that. If they wanted a relationship with us moving forward, they needed to earn it. It was the strongest I'd ever heard her speak to them. They absorbed it, nodding, accepting the terms she was setting. After dinner, my wife and I drove home in silence. Eventually, she said she felt lighter, like she'd been carrying something heavy for years and had finally set it down. I understood exactly what she meant. I made a decision that night. I reinstated the monthly payments, but I did it openly. I told my in-laws directly that I was resuming the financial support, explained the amount and the schedule, and laid out my expectations. The money was a gift, not a loan, but it came with strings attached. They would treat my wife and me with respect. They would make their own financial decisions without counting on the support as guaranteed income. They would acknowledge, at least privately, that I'd been helping them all along. They accepted the terms. More than that, they seemed grateful for the structure. My mother-in-law said she'd felt guilty spending money she didn't understand the source of, that knowing it came from me somehow made it feel more honest. My father-in-law mentioned he'd be more careful with their budget, now that he understood the full picture. Update 2. 3 months later, things had settled into a new normal. My in-laws visited occasionally, but they called first and respected when we said we were busy. They asked about my work with genuine interest instead of thinly veiled condescension. My mother-in-law even bragged about me to her friends, which my wife reported with amused disbelief. The real change showed up in small moments. My father-in-law asking my advice about an investment decision. My mother-in-law thanking me specifically for helping them. Both of them telling my wife, unprompted, how lucky she was to have married someone thoughtful and generous. It felt strange at first, almost performative, but gradually it started to seem genuine. My wife and I grew closer through all of this. The forced honesty about my income had opened up other conversations we'd been avoiding. She admitted she'd felt insecure about her own career, working in nonprofit management while I earned significantly more. We talked about what money meant to each of us, how we wanted to use it, what kind of life we were actually building together. We made plans based on reality instead of assumptions. I stopped being so secretive about success. I'd been treating my career like something to hide, afraid of judgment or jealousy or change dynamics. But keeping that secret had created its own problems, its own distortions in relationships. I learned there was a middle ground between bragging and hiding, a way to be honest about accomplishment without making it my entire identity. My in-laws took a modified cruise 6 months later, something shorter and less expensive than their original plan. They seemed just as happy with it, maybe more so because they weren't carrying the same financial stress. They sent us photos from every port, and my mother-in-law's messages included thank yous that felt earned rather than obligatory. The list stayed in my desk drawer. I kept it as a reminder, not out of spite, but as evidence of how wrong assumptions could be, how people could project their fears and insecurities onto others and convince themselves they were being helpful. Sometimes I'd take it out and read through the demands they'd made, the life they tried to force me into, and I'd feel grateful I'd trusted my own judgment instead. Looking back, I understood why I'd handled things the way I did. The secrecy, the anonymous money, the quiet tolerance of their disrespect. It had all been about maintaining control in a situation where I'd felt judged before anyone knew the full story. But control through deception had its costs. The revelation had been necessary, even if it was painful. My wife asked me once if I regretted how everything unfolded. I thought about it carefully before answering. I regretted the hurt feelings, the complicated emotions, the period where she'd questioned herself because of her parents' criticism and my silence. But I didn't regret the outcome. We'd all been forced to be honest, to examine our assumptions, to rebuild relationships on more solid foundations. That seemed worth the discomfort. Her parents learned something valuable too. They learned that their daughter had chosen well, even if they'd been too proud and prejudiced to see it initially. They learned that appearances could be deceiving, that someone driving a modest car and wearing regular clothes might be far more successful than someone performing wealth. They learned that respect should be given freely, not withheld until someone proved themselves according to arbitrary standards. The night I canceled that first transfer, sitting alone in my office, I'd felt a cold satisfaction. I'd had power they didn't know about, and I was exercising it. But that satisfaction had been hollow. Real satisfaction came later, when relationships were rebuilt honestly, when respect was mutual and genuine, when my wife and I were stronger together because we'd worked through something difficult. I still send the monthly money. I'll probably continue indefinitely because I can afford it, and it makes my wife happy to see her parents comfortable. But now everyone knows where it comes from, what it represents, what expectations accompany it. The transparency changed everything. The gift became a gift instead of a secret manipulation, and somehow that made it more meaningful for everyone involved. Sometimes my father-in-law and I get coffee, just the two of us. We talk about investments, politics, family dynamics. He treats me like an equal now, sometimes even defers to my opinion. It's a complete reversal from those early years when he'd barely acknowledge me at family gatherings. I don't gloat about the change. I just accept it as evidence that people can grow, that humiliation can be a catalyst for genuine transformation. My wife keeps that fact in perspective for me. She reminds me that her parents were wrong, but my secrecy hadn't been entirely right either. We'd all contributed to the dysfunction in different ways. The resolution required everyone to change, not just her parents acknowledging my worth, but also me learning to be more open, her learning to set boundaries more firmly. Family is complicated that way, requiring constant adjustment and honest communication. The revenge, if that's what it was, turned out to be less satisfying than I'd imagined. What satisfied me more was building something better from the wreckage, creating relationships based on truth instead of assumption. My in-laws learned their lesson, but I learned mine too. Silence might feel like strength in the moment, but real strength comes from vulnerability, from letting people see you fully and trusting that you're enough regardless of their judgment.